Hello and welcome back to this damn full idealistic crusade. This video is continuing in my series of rereading the classic Hardy Boys canon and comparing the two different text editions of the original textbooks, which comprise the first 38 volumes of the original canon, published by Grosset and Dunlap from the Straightmire Syndicate. So this is dealing with Book 9, The Great Airport Mystery, which was originally written and published in 1930 by series creator Leslie McFarlane, and then the 1965 revised text that is much more common and has been in print longer, of course, which was written by Tom Mulvey, who wrote a variety of different Hardy Boys editions over the years. Most of the revised texts are written by authors who either did multiple revised texts in other books in the canon series, and some even who went into the digest era of books after the original 58 that are considered the canon under Grosset and Dunlap. But this is a really interesting case because this is one of those books where, outside of the title and the fact that there's an aviation theme, the books are totally different. There is an airport that features in the story. It has the Hardy Boys cast of characters, and there's flying in airplane sequences and various sequences dealing with aircraft. Those are the only two things they really have in common. They diverge wildly very, very quickly. And so reading the original text after growing up with the revised text was a real shot in the arm, because this one, as I've said on all these videos so far, when you look at the original Leslie McFarlane text, while the story is much more simplistic, there's no sense of globetrotting that you get in the revised text. It's not as complicated in terms of all of the various plot scenarios and situations the boys find themselves in. The original text is much more two-fisted, much more suspense-driven, and it gets into darker territories that is not in the revised text. So to talk a little bit very, very briefly about the plot of each book. Well, I actually, thinking back, that might not be entirely fair, because there are a couple incidents that are reflected in the revised text, which is of course why when Rudy Nappy did his final cover, it's very similar to the second cover art design, because that is similar to what happens in the original text in terms of the boys investigating a particular crime on and around an airport. But also the books even open with a similar occurrence of the boys essentially being buzzed by an aircraft of some type, when they're just driving around. So you have an airplane literally buzzing them while they're in a car. And outside of a few little bits like that, and then the aviation theme, and of course the title, that's pretty much where the similarities end. So even in a case like this where the two books are completely different, there are some particular incidents that do stick around or get reflected or at least echoed in the revised text. So I guess then technically you can still call it the same title. But to talk about the plots a little bit, the original text has the boys dealing with, again, they essentially, which is something that happens in at least a few of the original texts, they encounter a particular individual. This is the airmail pilot Giles Ducroix, who basically becomes the sort of recurring villain of the piece. They cross paths essentially, and the boys wind up getting the better of him in his own nefarious ways, essentially hoisting himself on his own petard. But of course he blames the two youngsters for all of his troubles, and then as the story goes on, he becomes a sort of recurring villain, and then the boys have to keep continually matching wits with them in the course of investigating a mystery that's dealing with airmail thefts in and around the airport itself in their hometown of Bayport. So it's a much less convoluted, shall we say, in terms of the plot and the scenarios the boys find themselves in when you compare it to the revised text. But the intensity factor is ramped up, because in this book, at about halfway through, the boys themselves, and over the course of investigating the various thefts, become prime suspects, and on top of that, actually get arrested and thrown in jail. these are things you would never dream of in the revised text era for the boys to go through. So I can see why this was something that was immediately dropped and not featured in the revised text. And when I read this original text for the first time, that was a real shock, because I didn't expect to see something like that. And of course, the original text up to this point have portrayed the Bayport Police Force, headed by Chief Colleague, as not, shall we say, the most upstanding and very, very much prone to being somewhat lazy and somewhat lackadaisical, and portrayed in sort of comically inefficient ways. So it then becomes rather obvious the boys have been framed and they've just been thrown in jail anyway, and things aren't looking too good for them. But then, in a really nice slight nod of continuity, they are actually bailed out by two previously appearing characters, Herd Applegate from The Tower Treasure and Elroy Jefferson from the previous book Mystery of Cabin Island, who basically show up and can't believe that the boys would ever commit crimes, knowing their character so well, and they themselves put up the money since they are obviously already pretty well off. But it's a really nice touch. They don't really do anything outside of that, and you get at least a handful of reappearances, or at least an occasional mention in of various other characters and previous stories throughout the series. But it's very rare and infrequently done in the revised text. And in the original text, when things do happen like that, they are very believable, and so you might have a character or two reappear at a later date in a different book, like you have the two characters here. So that's a really nice touch and a very believable one for the situation the boys find themselves in. But that's probably the darkest moment for the boys in the book, in the terms of, you're not going to get this in the revised text. The boys falsely accused of crimes and thrown in jail and having to be bailed out. That was a real surprise. And then the original text essentially builds to a climax, which is wholly different from what is in the revised text. And again, like what you see when McFarlane wrote Secret of the Old Mill and House on the Cliff, and of course pretty much the entire second half of The Missing Chums, it is very much a suspense-driven sequence. It basically involves the boys becoming stowaways as the crime is undertaken, and they basically have to maintain their positions. And if they are discovered, they will very likely be murdered. So they basically they do throw caution to the wind a little bit and follow their own instincts and where the evidence has led them to this point. And it's wonderfully executed. It's not a earth-shattering climax. It's not they're not going to other countries or the island they go to in the revised text. It's not the most action-packed climax, but it is extremely suspenseful, and it takes place over an extended period of time. So it is really effective and, of course, very believable and extremely realistic. And since this is taking place, and the book was written in 1930, we are talking about the older world of aviation. So when we're talking about planes, they are planes of not today, or not the 50s or 60s like they are in the revised text, but planes of the early 1930s and the late 20s, really, because they're also in a lot of older planes. And that adds, I think, another element to the suspense and the danger factor, because you're not talking about a modern pressurized cabin or even a more modern plane from the 1950s. You're talking about biplanes and planes from the 20s, and of course, this is taking place in 1930. So that two-fisted spirit that's in all the original textbooks, you really get it here. And that is going to be the most unique factor in distinguishing the two texts in this example. So I think this is another case where I think both books are very strong, but I think it's going to depend, which you prefer is going to depend on which style of storytelling you like. Because when we switch over to the revised text, It, of course, carries the same title, still has an aviation theme, but was written in 1965 and deals with the boys trying to help their father investigate thefts that are taking place at the Stanwide Mining Company. And they're basically having all kinds of valuable property stolen while they are being transported by air. So, of course, since they are based and operate out of the local nearby airport, that's where you get, you can call this the Great Airport Mystery still. But not only do we have that set up, the boys go undercover by taking jobs at the mining company to try and see if, because it seems like it has to be an inside job, and of course, perils await them there. They collaborate with their father on this case, so it's not one of the classic Hardy Boys cliches of it's revealed by the end that the boys and their father were working on the same case the entire time and meet back up again at the end. Here it's one where they are basically deputized to go undercover. And then once that is pretty much out of the way, once their cover is blown, they do start investigating various personnel in the company and trailing them. And you get a nice bit of using various detective methods, also getting the chums involved. So we have more appearances from Chet Morton and Biff Hooper. And it's also got a nice bit where they're following two different suspects, and basically they all split up and go their separate ways. And you get two parallel tales being told. But then there's also a rather interesting sort of supernatural element, because it becomes very quickly obvious that there is another presence involved, and then they encounter a story of the former chief employee of the company who died under mysterious circumstances, and then that sort of presence manifests itself, and that perhaps in the course of investigating this mystery and the various employees of the mining company, that they're being followed or haunted by the ghost of the probably murdered former chief employee of the company. So that's another interesting touch that's exclusive to the revised text. In addition to that, there are many more action set pieces. As I alluded to before, there is an island that's discovered that is sort of a stopover point. So the boys eventually do have to fly out there, and of course, once they get there, even though it's kind of a deserted island, then of course there's a sort of tropical storm, and they have a near peril experience. This is even after when they're trying to observe a potential location for a villain's hideout. They're flying around in a helicopter, and then a tornado just happens to come by. So if that doesn't start to indicate that the revised text really amps up the action, I don't know what will, because again, the revised text, like most of the best revised text, they really do pile on the action, the set pieces, and they make the stories more convoluted, and they then expand the horizons. So while this is still mostly set around Bayport, so it's still relatively one of the hometown stories, it does expand a little bit. They do go into the countryside more. They do go to this deserted island, which is way out in the ocean, so they have to do a long distance journey there and back and worry about fuel consumption. It definitely expands the story constraints quite a lot with the various subplots that are added, and the new mystery of the same title being much more convoluted. And they do all this, and of course the revised text has the shorter page count, as all the revised texts do. So this one is about 175 pages, whereas the original text is about 210 pages or so. So again, it's a really interesting example where the much shorter book tells a much more complicated and convoluted story, while the original text has the seemingly on the surface more simplistic story, but has the greater amount of time to be able to tell it in its own way and have the much greater description in terms of characters and language, and of course, as I always say, the world building. And you always really get that from the McFarlane written original text. So I think this is one really very much like the Shore Road Mystery, where both texts are really well done, and they're both very representative of the original texts at their best and the revision texts at their best. It's not always a fair comparison because the Straightmeyer Syndicate had their own rules and had their own constraints already in place, and McFarlane was the writer who got the ball rolling by being the one to write the majority of the original text and do the first book and basically be given the sort of title and prompt, and then, just had to be X number of pages and then hop to it. The revised text had a lot more constraints and, of course, a much smaller page count to work with. And in a case like this, they could, or the new writer could perhaps cherry pick a couple of moments or images or ideas from the original text. But I guess the edict was, in this case, to just completely ignore the original text entirely outside of that and just start from scratch. So it's really impressive that it pulls it off in the revised text with a much shorter page count. It is one of the more action-packed of the revised texts, and they're still both great books and great fun to read. Which you prefer, again, is going to be up to what your preference is. And if you've read some of the other books in both the text editions, going into this one, because they are different and they're not telling the same story, you can tell very quickly, I think, which one you might gravitate more towards. But I think both are still excellent. It's really hard to go wrong with any of the first, anything in the first 10 or so books of any series are going to be solid foundational building blocks, especially if the series goes on for a long time. So again, here you can't really go wrong with any of the first 9 or so. They're all really strong, and then a lot of those qualities were carried over into the revised text, even if, as we have here, the stories are really completely different. So rereading this and doing that as part of this series, I was struck by how the revised text was suddenly making me feel it was very similar in ways to what the revised text of the Shore Road Mystery does, in terms of really piling on the action, really upping the danger stakes, and also adding in subplots and really making the story much more complicated, and again, really expanding the action quite a bit. So I think both are great. I can't really choose one over the other. Again, you do really see very quickly that the McFarlane text is the better written in terms of just from a literary standpoint, I think. But again, it's not really a fair comparison because the original texts were mostly written more like a novel, and the revised texts were designed to be focused on keeping younger audiences hooked to get to the next chapter. Each chapter kind of has a little bit of a cliffhanger, which the original texts do as well, but with the shorter page count and the greater focus and emphasis on action, the pace is much quicker, and you don't have the time or the ability to really just soak in the atmosphere. And I think that is slightly abated here in really good examples like this, when they really do pile on the action, and they also pile on the plot development, because again, we have the whole sort of opening section of the book is the boys doing an undercover mission, which of course is nowhere to be found in the original text. So this is another example where I think both books are excellent, even though they really are completely different. So in short, for my own sort of personal opinion, what I got out of reading both books, I do think that the original text is the better written book. I think it's the more gripping of the two because of going to very dark places. Again, the boys get falsely arrested and thrown in jail. That was a real surprise. And then the whole climax, the whole final act of the book, is extremely suspenseful, even though it has nowhere near the convolutions of any of the plot of the revised text. But I do miss some of those revised text bits. I do really love how the revised text adds that slight flavor of the supernatural, and it is very well done. I mean, ever since I was a kid, I was wondering how you were actually supposed to whistle High Journey, and the idea of a ghost that still whistles its favorite tune after being dead all this time was just a fascinating idea that always stuck in my mind. So the revised text is still the book I think of when you say great airport mystery. I think the revised text has great strengths and again wonderful action set pieces, and it really does pile it on. Again, so I can't help but make the comparison to the revision of the Shore Road mystery. So I love both books. I'm very much still used to the revised text that I grew up with, but the original text was a very wonderful, pleasing surprise. And again, with pretty much all the McFarlane books, the sense of world building, the sense of texture is so much greater that you can feel yourself really get invested into it more than what you're used to in the much more quickly paced revised text. And that seems to be the sort of common thread of discussion with other fans, and I keep running into that with each of these videos in comparison so far. So I don't think that's going to change really for any of the McFarlane written books for the most part. So to then talk about the cover art designs like I like to do, there are only 3 to discuss here, and they follow pretty much the same pattern that I've talked about in the past 8 books. So we have the original cover once again done by W.S. Rogers in the same style with the red text and the original logo across the top. This again is depicting an actual event from the book, and it seems rather simplistic at first, like it's a sort of almost all of these covers that Rogers did, they have a sense of they're almost always practically outdoors, so they have a sort of outdoor painting feel to them. Here we of course have some of the aerial action that takes place in the book, and it seems very simple at first, like what you see on Rogers' cover for The Shore Road Mystery or Secret of the Old Mill, or and really any of his. But once you look more closely, that's when you can start to notice, hey, wait a minute, those aren't just 2 planes in the air. That the top plane is actually apparently dropping something. And that is indeed an action set piece from the original text where the boys are sabotaged and almost actually killed by actually trying to trail a plane, and then the plane dropping this this sort of metallic substance into the propeller to basically destroy their propeller. Again, this is in a plane in 1930 where you don't have the same sort of modern safety precautions or more than one propeller or more than one engine. So, you lose that one propeller and yeah, you're pretty screwed. So it's, again, a really nice, very suspenseful sequence. And so you have it depicted here on the cover. That, of course, the problem is with all of these that if you're just, glancing at it very quickly, it doesn't exactly draw the eye at first. But once you actually look at the action being depicted, it's like, oh, that's actually quite dangerous. Okay, now I see what's going on. But also the actual the item that's dropped, it doesn't, if you don't pay attention, it kind of looks like there's just like a piece of dust on the cover and you want to try to scrape it off, but of course it's part of the original painting. And of course all this stuff makes sense once you actually read the text itself, so you then know, oh, that's the event that the dust jacket image is actually conveying. This would actually last until, of course, the Yellow Spine era, when almost all the books got new covers and the updating of the dust jacket design, done by the artist known by the name of Stricker, who is still, there's not too much information about him, but he did do some of the original text covers through the years and some of the front piece arts as well. Like almost all of the Yellow Spine era, I have the same general complaint that while the image is much more dynamic, and here we have nice composition, nice shadow, an actual event from the book being depicted when the boys stumble across another theft that's happened in the airport, and we have the cop with the sort of broken plank of wood and the footprints they're looking at. The color is really nice on this in terms of it's got the purple, yellow, and green with some reddish in terms of the skin tone. So it does really jump out at you, and it matches the Yellow Spine very well. And we have the new updated font logo for the actual Hardy Boys logo, the typical text of most Yellow Spine era covers. But it does have that very cartoonish flavor to it in terms of how the actual figures are depicted, and a slight cartoonish style to the overall to the actual painting itself and all the fine details. But that that I'm used to, and I don't mind so much. It's not my personal preference, but it still looks good. The one thing here, though, is the boys themselves look very odd in terms of the actual. Their heads seem a little bit too small for their bodies, and their actual faces, the way they're drawn, they look very strange. Sometimes when you see covers through the years, the boys are usually in some sort of a amusing pose in a moment of danger. So if you actually look at it closely, they're always in some sort of or and of course you can't help but laugh at it as you stare at it over and over and over, or you reread the books over the years, and that's just inherently funny and that would be the same with anything. But then sometimes you see where the artist unfortunately maybe didn't get the faces down really well, or there's something that just seems a little clunky. And since I've owned a copy with this cover for many years, I've looked at it a number of times, and it's always seemed odd to me how the boys' faces look. They just don't come across. They just look very strange. And then we have. But outside of that, I do think the composition is really lovely. I like how the lighting is coming in from the sort of hangar and starts to fade off, and it does look like it's taking place at night or in the darker recesses of the hangar. And there is at least a slight ominous feeling to it because of the color and the composition. But it is outshined, I think, as I usually feel with all of these when it's redone by Rudy Nappy in 1960. And this, of course, would be still the cover in print today because this has not been redesigned. The Penguin reprints really stopped at Cabin Island. This is the same sort of event, but done in a much more realistic style. There's no problem with the boys' heads seeming the wrong shape or size. The only thing I've ever thought about this cover, though, in terms of maybe a minor criticism, is the boys here do look quite young. They don't quite look 16 and 17 or 18, depending on the original text. They're aged slightly differently than they are in the revised text. So the Hardy Boys are always supposed to technically be teenagers, and here they literally do look like boys. It's a minor thing, but I think it's also heightened by the fact that they're standing in the doorway of the hangar, and Frank's looking down at Joe, and Frank doesn't look very tall in this shot, and there's a big plane in the background. And you, of course, have, again, the cop with the broken piece of wood in the foreground, but done in a much more realistic style. It's, of course, broad daylight here, and you can see the airplane and the sort of air tower in the background, so you can see the sort of runway. So it has a much more realistic air to it. However, it doesn't have the same sort of ominous quality the second cover does. So I think there's positives in both covers, and it is the same image. This is where Rudy Nappy's just told, hey, we want you to redo this cover in your style, but just tweak it a little bit. I like this. That the figures, the way they're staged, is rather similar, so you do keep some of that nice composition. And I've always liked that the cop in the foreground is in nice detail, but also the piece of broken wood he's holding. You can see Nappy has painted all the details of the wood grain and the actual broken edge, and you can see the details of the footprints on the ground. So this is the cover I'm going to think of when you say Great Airport Mystery. And since it was 1960, there will be copies floating around out there in the sort of picture cover era that do still have the original text for a little while. So this is one of those where if you want the final Rudy Nappy cover with the original text, it does exist. You just have to track down a specific copy before the revision came out in 1965. So it's just these three covers for the book, and I think they're all great, actually. I can nitpick all of them, but I think anybody can nitpick a cover design or painting. That's not to say that they're bad or I dislike them. I like and really enjoy all three of them, and I think they do fit their respective books. I wouldn't say I would call any of them perfect, but I do think the Rudy Nappy one edges out overall because I prefer his style and the greater sense of realism and detail. And of course, it's the cover I'm used to because I read the book countless times growing up and was reading the revised text with Rudy Nappy's artwork. Now I'll talk about the books in my collection in terms of editions. So my first one is indeed from the Yellow Spine era. So we have the second cover design. And as you can see, the color is much bolder on an actual copy. This is usually what you find on copies from the Yellow Spine era, which of course is represented here by the redesigned Yellow Spine. So of course, when I say Yellow Spine era, I'm referring to these 1940s Yellow Spine copies. The back is advertising the Rick Brant series, which is another adventure series for boys from the Straightmeyer Syndicate, because why stop with one successful children's series when you can have as many as humanly possible? On the inside, we have, of course, the classic orange Greta end papers, and then the book list goes to the Sign of the Crooked Arrow, which would date this to about 1949 in terms of the actual printing date. The interior has new front piece art that was done for a lot of books by this time point, where they switched to a more simplistic black and white inked drawing instead of the much fancier sort of photo page style printed painting that was in original editions. Sometimes they would copy the same bit of art, but others would just completely redo it from scratch. And I think this is really where you get the idea for the similar inked drawings that sort of look like almost pencil line drawings that are in the revised text throughout the book itself. And of course, you have the original text layout and design for the actual text block. You slip the cover off and you have the classic Hardy Boys logo and what you're used to with the brown boards, but this is not what you would call the classic tweed. That would come in a little bit later. This is after the wartime copies had stopped, but this still has a slightly... It's always hard to describe this. It's not a rubbery or plasticky compound or whatever the boards are made of, but they give off that impression of having a slightly... there's just like a sheen to them, and you can even kind of see it in the light. If you've ever handled any Hardy Boys books from the 40s or early 50s around this time period without their dust jackets, as most of them don't have the dust jackets, you'll probably know what I'm talking about. When you get even a nice copy like this, it definitely is still, I think this all stems from it still being after the wartime restrictions had ended. They were still not back to making the full, I hate to say full quality, but it still wasn't quite like it was before the war. And of course, wartime editions used the really pulpy, cheaper paper, and of course, they all brown very heavily, and so the wartime editions are usually in the worst condition. And then shortly after this, they would have the full tweed printing on all later copies throughout the 1950s. So, of course, when you say brown tweed, that's what you're thinking of. This is sort of getting there, and the design is the same, of course. This was my childhood copy, so I still have it in my collection. So this is the picture cover with the Rudy Nappy artwork. This is a printing that dates to about 1967 because of the spine text in terms of the actual text used for the number. That always changes around depending on the era of the book you're looking at. But also, of course, you look at the book list and it ends at The Secret Agent on Flight 101. So that dates this to 1967. So that, of course, means that this carries the revised text. So you open it up and we have the classic black and white multi-scene end papers. And here's the new front piece artwork reflecting a scene exclusive to the revised text. And of course, the iconic revised text block and layout design. This also being the revised text, you get the lovely drawings throughout in terms of the bits of artwork in the same black and white inked design as the front piece artwork. So again, that's something that's exclusive to the revised text. But all of these in this one really do deal significantly with action and moments of suspense and drama. And of course, as I alluded to before, they really went full tilt when you have the boys in a 1960s helicopter, and all of a sudden they're right next to a tornado. So, in the midst of looking for criminals who are, of course, going to start opening fire on them. So yeah, it's not like they're resting on their laurels at all, but you get those exclusive to the revised text. And then we have my flashlight copy, which is, of course, from the flashlight printing series. This is the revised text. These were done throughout the 1990s and 2000s. They really started in the late 80s, actually. These are the most common versions available, and you can easily complete a set of the whole revised text canon of 58 books in the flashlight editions. They have the very hard and glossy sheen to them, and as you can see, they do wind up cropping on the sides of the original artwork. So usually the dimensions are slightly changed, and it also depends, as I've already discussed in previous videos, on the year, the manufacturing year of the book. So usually if you get a flashlight from 2002 and before, in terms of the printing dates, they're well done, and they're pretty good about being presenting the art well. But after that, that's when you run into more sort of variations. This is done rather well. It's only got the usual minimal cropping on the top, but rather interestingly, if you look here on some flashlights, this happens. If you look here, you see a little tiny bit of red poking through right next to Frank's arm there. And at first you may think, oh, well, that's just part of the plane or something. But no, of course, what that is actually the iconic red Hardy Boys logo starting to creep in. They did have this happen sometimes on some of the covers because the logo's a circle. It naturally goes over a bit onto the front and back of the spine. So when somebody did the scan for this, I guess the source they had actually had the logo still there. So you'll see that every once in a while on a flashlight copy where they haven't cropped it out and the image is nice and centered, but here you have a little bit of the original red spine poking through. That, of course, was no longer used. They just switched to the top logo for all the flashlights. So, of course, we open it, and we have the updated book checklist, and all of the flashlights have the very nice, very bright white pages in terms of the actual paper, because they're all printed on recycled paper. This is a 1998 printing, and so now I definitely feel old because my flashlight copy is 25 years old. Jeez. And, of course, there is page 1. So everything else is the same, of course, except for the fact that you have the updated mail-away list in the back. And unfortunately, none of the flashlights have anything on the end papers. They're just blank. And of course, they all have the same rear cover, too, that is standardized to only mention the first 6 titles. So those are my thoughts on Book 9 of the original Hardy Boys canon, The Great Airport Mystery, both the 1930 original Leslie McFarlane written text and the 1965 revised text by Tom Mulvey. Both are excellent books in their respective part of the Hardy Boys canon. Both are still excellent adventures for young and old alike to read and reread many, many times over. They're really well done, well executed. And as I said, they really exemplify all the best aspects of the original text and the revised text. And it's one of the books because it's one of the first 10. It's readily available. You will, as with any of the original text, you will have to sort of hunt around a bit to get a specific original text printing, depending on which one you want to go for, or if you just want a reading copy, you do have to specify in terms of looking at copies. You will have to go in and look at the page count, the copyright date, and it's pretty easy to tell if you have an original text because it's longer and the copyright date is, of course, 1930. But you do have to actually track down the original text. They are unfortunately not in print Although the first couple books are now starting to enter the public domain, and Dover has already reprinted the Tower Treasure, and now a lot of other people are starting to jump on and do cheapy public domain printings of the first three books. We still have to wait a little while to see even here at book 9 to enter the public domain, but that will happen eventually. So but of course I would advise not waiting that long, a couple more years. But it's still readily available if you want to pick up either the revised or original text. So this is another example where, even though the story is completely different, they're both excellent books, even though they carry the same title and have very little to do with each other outside of a couple events and a shared aviation theme. The original text is quite a bit darker and does have some more suspenseful set pieces to it, and it's wonderfully written, as all the McFarlane books are. However, the revised text has many great strengths of its own, and I wouldn't do without it either, because there's so much in it that I love and was part of my childhood, and it's still an enjoyable read. And so I think you really need to have both, as you do for all of these. But this is one where both books are really strong, and it's really fun to go back and revisit them and then do this comparison read, because you can see what echoes and what elements are actually retained in the revised text, even though it's telling a completely different story and keeping the title. And I just find this kind of stuff fascinating. That's why I'm doing videos about them. So I hope this has been at least somewhat fun and informative to hear me once again babble on about the classic Hardy Boys mystery series, one of the most iconic children's literature series of all time. I will never grow tired of returning to the town of Bayport and reading Frank and Joe's adventures. And this back-to-back comparison series has been a wonderful way to just come to the series fresh and have a new way of rediscovering my love of the canon, and then doing these fun literary comparisons between the two texts and see all the fun various differences, and then look at my collection again and all the different editions and the cover arts and things. So I hope you guys enjoy this as much as I am doing these, and I will continue on, and hopefully soon I will have my video done and prepared for book 10, What Happened at Midnight. So as always, keep supporting your local independent bookstores by buying physical books and, of course, Hardy Boys books, and by also reading print books to help keep book culture alive. And thank you ever so much for watching.